They have to be able to articulate and live the values of the company authentically, and they have to be able to accelerate innovation.
Hello and welcome to How I Hire, the podcast that taps directly into the best executive hiring advice and insights. I'm Roy Nodowitz, founder and CEO of Nodo Group Executive Search. You can learn more about us at nodogroup.com. As a go-to firm for purpose-driven companies, we've been lucky to work with some of the world's most inspiring leaders as they've tackled the challenge of building high-performance leadership teams. Now, I'm sitting down with some of these very people to spark a conversation about how to achieve success in hiring and create purposeful leadership for the next generation of companies. Katherine Melchior joins me on the podcast today. She has over 25 years experience in global marketing and brand development, with an impressive track record of success catalyzing growth across industries from hospitality to media to luxury consumer goods and beyond. She's led international marketing initiatives for companies like Nike, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Hyatt, and Shiseido. And today she's both a teacher and consultant, helping others to expand their business across the global marketplace. Katherine and I discuss lessons learned from working across many different consumer sectors and how that's shaped her hiring philosophy. We also cover how she develops cultural competency and much more. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's dive right in. You've had an incredibly exciting career as a global marketing and business leader across many consumer segments, including media, retail, fashion, personal care and beauty, and technology. Take us through some of your career highlights and the path that led you to where you are today.
I've had the good fortune to be able to work across 5 different industries on 3 continents. And I think what's led to those changes, if I look backwards, is a combination of external and internal changes. External, of course, company changes, new markets opening, losing my job, and internal changes of recognizing that what I want to do next changes. And I think that's a really important part about life and managing one's career. So, for instance, I started out with this fascination of Japan. I studied Japanese in college and I wanted to be a journalist. And I went to Japan right after college and I actually found my way into a Japanese TV network. I ended up producing a TV show that introduced the Japanese audience, it aired in Japan, to American products. And I would research products that were not yet in Japan, figure out a compelling story, and then actually do the direct distribution with the company to sell it into Japan. So it was an entire direct marketing. And so I learned how to identify products that would sell in Japan. I came back and I didn't want to be just a Japan hand. So I worked for one of the companies whose story I had looked into, which was Hannah Anderson.
Oh, interesting. Gun Denhart.
Gun Denhart, founder. So imagine going from large Japanese standard conservative corporation to Gun Denhart here in Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon, yeah.
Swedish values, very futuristic with, the triple bottom line. So then I helped her grow her international business. And I got very interested in marketing to women, at which point Nike came along. It was back in the day that, if you were in Portland, Nike would come calling. And it took us a while to find a job that I would be passionate about, but I had been an athlete in high school and college and junior Olympic volleyball. When they asked me to come in to grow the women's footwear business in the 90s, how could I say no? It was very personally motivating. Spent several years there. It was very helpful and interesting and productive. And they finally got rid of that role. So I was a free agent and I ended up doing consulting for various companies, one of which was Nordstrom. I was working with them on Japan. I was working with them on a French brand in case they were to buy it, called Façonnable. So I wrote the global business plan. And a year later, they said, oh, well, we bought it. Go build it. So on September 11th, 2001, my husband, 2 children, 16 bags, and a dog flew from New York to Nice and landed on September 11th.
Wow.
Yeah. And then Louis Vuitton found me and sent me back to Japan. So I spent many, many years, about 20 years in retail all over the world. At Louis Vuitton, I was vice president of marketing in Japan. I worked with Gucci in Asia and strategic planning. And after a while, I started to get tired of things, just too many things. I was at the pinnacle of product, fashion, culture, and my own values were changing. My children were growing up, and I wanted to settle down and move to experience. So I went to Hyatt and I ran the Park Hyatt and Grand
Interesting.
Hyatt brands globally.
So cool.
Years later, I went back to consulting and was working for Shiseido, $10 billion company in Japan, for a year and a half on how can they transition from a Japanese marketing company to a global prestige marketing company. And after a year and a half, the CEO asked if I would come in full time. And so I went back to Japan. This is now industry number 4. And I went into cosmetics with Shiseido. As I was at Shiseido, growing Japanese origin brands internationally, I realized how much those teams, this was 2017, 18, how much those teams needed to embrace the digital first mentality. And they were late to the game. And we needed to do a complete digital transformation. I realized for myself as a marketer, I needed to get into the tech game. And so Babel came calling in Germany to be CMO. And so I went over there right before the pandemic and cut my teeth.
That's amazing. So you've been exposed to different hiring practices in a variety of world-class companies. What are some of the experiences, learnings, or best practices that have shaped your leadership and hiring philosophy over the years?
That's actually really quite interesting because it's true. I have been recruited and hired on 3 different continents, and they are quite different. When you go to certain companies that try to really have cultures reflecting their brand, the more you can put yourself into the mind of the consumer and the mind of the culture, the better able you are to land on your feet. The other thing I'll say that's quite different, and I think it's a challenge for companies in the Pacific Northwest and for the United States in general, is a closer understanding to cultural difference. So when you live in a foreign country, obviously you learn daily. You go out the door and everything is different. That kind of proximity to a different language, a different currency, a different history, a different way of being makes you realize very early on in a company's growth that you have to embrace difference to grow. And I think in the US, we are both privileged and challenged by our size. Privileged in that we have this enormous market, even though there are differences across the country. But then we have these 2 huge oceans on either side that sort of buffer us from other countries. Of course, we have Canada. They're a lot like Americans. And then we have Mexico that we have not, I think, really respected as a market.
Yeah. So having all this significant global experience, how did you navigate the language barriers and develop enough cultural competency to credibly motivate and influence?
Well, this is one reason why my background is quite unusual, is that I have on-the-ground marketing experience in multiple countries. So it's one thing to go over and lead a business in different countries if you have a base. It's another thing to do the marketing in that market. You have to have your ear close to the market, close to the consumer. And this is why I think language is actually a hidden power tool of a career. And I think also in the US, we don't value it enough. It has certainly been a key asset of mine. So as I said, I'm American. I grew up speaking English, but I went to a French school in San Francisco. I learned Spanish in high school. And then in college, I was fascinated by Japan. So I tried to learn Japanese. And so language has been incredibly helpful for me. One thing for people who don't speak languages is when I brought Hannah Anderson to Japan, small company, I brought several of our employees and my team, and we created a customer service center in Tokyo. And these people did not speak Japanese, who I brought with me, but they were very good at listening. And I would always say, you have 1 mouth and 2 ears.
Mm-hmm.
So listen twice as much as you speak. And in Japan, so much communication is nonverbal.
Yeah.
So if you walk into a room and observe with your eyes and listen with your ears and try to read the air. There's an expression in
Yeah,
Japanese called
I've heard this before.
kuki o yomu,
Yeah,
and it means read the air. And so if you can go in and do that, you may not get all of it, but you will get half of it.
amazing. So what are some other learnings that you can share around hiring, aligning, and leading global teams?
One of the interesting things is that each country is quite different. So if you're looking for a job in your own country or you want to go to another country, understanding how that country works in context. So for global businesses, Americans are very expensive.
Yes, we've run into that
Yes.
challenge.
So I think Americans don't realize their own talent in a global marketplace. In my case, I started in Japan, but I came to the US early. And then one might say I took a pay cut to go to Europe. And then I ended up in Japan again with Louis Vuitton. But in many ways, it was an investment because then I made more money than
Yeah,
I ever did. Because
yeah,
then I had skills in the US, in Europe, in Japan. And I speak all three of those
yeah,
languages. And so I think that if Americans can tend to see that in that perspective, if
yeah,
they want global careers, it's very,
yeah.
very helpful.
That's good advice around managing your career because if you look at opportunities as future retained earnings because you're building your experience and knowledge and
Exactly.
portfolio.
Right.
So when you come into a new organization, what's your approach to developing an understanding of the capabilities, the roles, and the leadership of the people and the teams that you're inheriting?
Again, a lot of listening, right? I talk a lot about language, and I think language is not just speaking, but it's listening. So, a lot of leading and listening. And then I spend a lot of time on one on ones. I think it's extremely important to get to know people one on one. And so, I will over index on the early side of getting to know not only my team, but my peers and the organization as a whole.
So how do you determine when to invest and develop and bring somebody along versus managing them out of the
Yeah,
organization, which is always a tough thing to do?
it is a tough thing to do. And I have lost my job, so I'm very sensitive to that. Again, I go back to my early training in Japan. In Japan, people don't fire. And I think that colored my perception so that in the US, when someone would say, well, that person's not doing very well, let's just fire them, I'd be like, no, I can see they have talent. They're just not
Right.
in the right role. And so I am someone who tends to believe that people are all very capable. They just may not be in the right role. So I don't really like to fire. However, if someone is really not capable at the level of work, then you want to let them go as soon as possible. And in that case, I believe the faster the better. It's extremely important to do it with compassion. So separate the person from the tasks.
Right.
Treat the person as whole as you can with respect, and then tell them the tasks we need are not fitting to their skills.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes people get promoted, right, beyond what they're capable of doing, or the company gets to a point where they just need a different kind of leadership. So, just curious, in France, my experience working with French companies is that they really value tenure as well. Is that true?
Japan is tenure.
Okay.
Japan is tenure and age. France is definitely authority. They
Okay.
respect authority. I do this chart of trying to understand different cultures, Japan, France, US. And I say, look, both of those countries had kings and emperors. There's a reason they respect authority. And you think of the US where we rejected having a
Yeah.
king or an emperor or anything like that, then you start to realize why we have a much more egalitarian workforce than they do in France or Japan. So I do think that notion of France is not so much they respect tenure, but they respect authority.
So, let's talk about how you make decisions on important hires. What's the process for sifting through inputs and feedback? Who do you involve when you're making important hires for your leadership team?
First of all, I figure out exactly what I need. What is the role I really need? And how does that role fit into the team as a whole? And then through the interview process, I will want multiple people to interview that person. I'm a big believer in diversity. Obviously, I've worked internationally. I've been a woman in multiple markets. I've been an American in multiple markets. And so I believe in the value of diversity. And I think that it is very important to work twice as hard to find people from different backgrounds.
So, What learnings or insights have you gained from hiring successes and failures?
One of the key things is listening to other people in the team because you can't make someone successful on your own. You can help
Right.
them succeed, but they're going to have to be standing on their own 2 feet in an organization with their own team and their other peers. And so you have to listen to what other people say. You don't have to follow it, but
Right.
you need to be aware of those signposts. And I think one of the key things is adaptability. How does someone think? How have they learned from their past successes and failures? That's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
How do they learn from their failures? We've talked a lot about change and turbulence,
Yeah.
and how do you learn from that? And have they adapted? Do they learn from prior mistakes? Is the person adaptable? I mean, the world is constantly
Yeah.
changing, and you want leaders who are going to be able to embrace that and lead through it.
That's great. What do you think makes a great CMO? What are the elements? If I'm an executive hiring a CMO right now for a premium consumer brand, what are the things that you think are key?
The CMO roles changed a lot. They have to be able to set a vision. They have to be able to articulate and live the values of the company authentically. And they have to be able to accelerate innovation. I think one of the key things for a CMO is being half left brain, half right brain.
Right.
I had to do some sort of a personality profile for a recruiter in Europe. And they were like, oh my God, you are 50-50. And I'm like, what does that mean? I don't want to be 50-50. I want to be 100-100. And they said, oh no, you're 50 left brain, 50 right brain. And apparently that was one of the key things for a marketing role. And I learned what they mean. And the notion of that is you have to be able to read the data, appreciate data, love data, go into the data, but the data will not tell you the answer. It will direct you to the area and the need. And then the answer is using your right brain and the creativity.
You had talked about marketing and having a history background. So, why does having a history degree or background help?
History teaches us how to see evolution. What were the strains that caused something over time to happen? And so you have to read the tea leaves, if
Yeah.
you will, looking at political, social, cultural, financial strains that come to some kind of turning point. Marketing is creating demand for the future. So you have to be able to be very in tune with current culture and what are all of the strains that are going on that are forcing changes that we don't quite see yet, because you want to be a half step in front of your
Yeah.
consumer. If you're a full step, you're too far in front. And if you're a half step behind, someone else is going to get in between.
Yeah.
So you have to be just a half step in front of your consumer to be able to understand all of these changes that are slowly building so that you can create strategies, products, services, and teams to be able to manifest.
So, how does a CMO or a marketing leader do that? Are there examples that you can think of that would help?
That's the job. I mean, it's a fun and complex job. I always start with research, whether it's building the teams, as I mentioned, or whether it's for understanding the business to see what's happened in the past. I need to understand where we have had the best successes, what people's strengths and weaknesses may be. And then I look at where the market is today and really try to understand what are the deep pressures on the
Yeah.
consumer and on the market in different markets, right? So you have different markets in different
Yeah.
parts of the world, and you can't do it all yourself. So you need to help ask those questions so that your teams
Right.
will be empowered to do that in their markets.
Yeah. So, tell us about the book. Where did the idea come from? What compelled you? Because that's a big undertaking.
I think as I was living this life of being an international CMO who was the head of household, making decisions, of course, with my husband, I just found no one was there having these same challenges. And I felt that people need to understand what it's like so that more companies can support both men and women in these roles of being an expat with children and what's called a trailing spouse, not
Yeah.
very
I remember.
empathetically, and to be a woman in that situation because it is particularly hard. as most of those environments are very male dominated. It's about taking risks. It's about learning to be resilient. And it's about sometimes reinventing yourself. We talked about consumer marketing and insights and how you have to listen to an audience. The same thing is true of yourself. So the book talks a lot about listening to foreign markets, listening to literally foreign consumers,
Yeah.
but then ultimately trying to listen to the changes deep within.
Fascinating. So, in addition to the book, how are you thinking about the future and what new and exciting things are you working on currently?
Well, I'm always very excited at this time of year because I'm going into my fall teaching. So I teach at Berkeley Haas School of Business in the fall, and I teach global marketing. And it really is a class about culture. I'm really excited about my class and the work I do between my consulting, helping international businesses grow both their business through marketing and their teams through this kind of diversity and bringing diverse teams together. My fundamental belief is that learning to understand explicitly foreign cultures helps us understand the diversity at home.
Interesting. Well, this has been such a great interview. I really appreciate your time. We're doing this in person, which I appreciate, and it's great to see you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's been really fun.
Thanks for tuning in to How I Hire. Visit howihire.com for more details about what you heard today, as well as show notes and other podcasts that we've done in the past. How I Hire is created by Noda Group Executive Search. To find out more about Noda Group, visit nodagroup.com, and you can also sign up for our newsletter there, where we share monthly updates on jobs and projects that we're working on. This podcast was produced by A.O. McLean, LLC. To learn more about their great work, visit aomclean.com.